Emma had always dreamed of an adventurous honeymoon, a trip into the heart of nature where she and Daniel could disconnect from the world and focus on each other. When Daniel suggested a remote forest getaway, she had been thrilled. The idea of being surrounded by towering trees, the sounds of wildlife, and the crisp, fresh air seemed like the perfect way to celebrate their new life together. She trusted Daniel completely, never questioning his intentions. As they drove deeper into the wilderness, Emma marveled at the breathtaking scenery, unaware of the sinister plan her husband had in mind. The further they went, the fewer signs of civilization they saw. The paved roads turned to dirt paths, and soon they were surrounded by nothing but dense, towering trees. The sunlight barely broke through the canopy, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. Emma noticed a shift in Daniel's demeanor. He had been warm and affectionate in the morning, but now he seemed distant, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. He barely responded to her excited chatter, and when she reached for his hand, he pulled away. Emma brushed it off, assuming he was just tired from the long drive. But deep inside, a tiny seed of unease took root. Something felt off. After hours of traveling, Daniel finally stopped the car near a narrow, unmarked trail. "Let's stretch our legs," he said flatly, grabbing a backpack and stepping out. Emma followed, feeling a rush of excitement despite the growing tension in the air. They walked deeper into the forest, following an overgrown path. The towering trees surrounded them like silent watchers, their thick branches swaying gently in the breeze. Birds chirped overhead, and the distant sound of a running stream added to the tranquility of the moment. But Emma's excitement turned to confusion when Daniel suddenly stopped walking. He set the backpack down, looked at her with a cold, unreadable expression, and then did something that made her heart drop. He turned around and started walking away. "Daniel," she called after him, laughing nervously. "Where are you going?" He didn't answer. He didn't even glance back. Panic shot through her as she took a step forward, but Daniel only walked faster. She ran after him, reaching for his arm, but he yanked himself free and shoved her backward. Emma stumbled, barely managing to stay on her feet. Her breath hitched. "Daniel, stop joking. What's wrong?" He finally looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes terrified her. There was no warmth, no regret, no second thoughts, just cold, calculated indifference. "This is where we say goodbye, Emma," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Emma's world shattered in an instant. What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he turned his back on her again, picked up the backpack, her backpack, filled with their supplies, and started walking away. Emma's stomach twisted into a tight knot. "Daniel, please, don't do this," she begged, her voice rising. She tried to follow, but he moved too fast. She sprinted after him, but he reached the clearing before she could catch up. Without hesitation, he climbed into the car, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. Emma ran forward, waving her arms. "Daniel, please, you can't leave me here." But he didn't stop. He didn't even hesitate. The car roared to life, the tires kicking up dirt as he reversed onto the trail. Emma screamed his name, but it was useless. She watched, paralyzed with disbelief, as the love of her life, the man she had vowed to spend forever with, drove away, disappearing between the trees. A cold, suffocating silence followed. Emma's knees buckled and she collapsed onto the forest floor, her body trembling. Her mind raced, refusing to accept what had just happened. This couldn't be real. This had to be some cruel prank. Any moment now, Daniel would come back, laughing, saying it was just a test. But deep inside, she knew the truth. She was alone, stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no supplies, no phone, and no way out. The weight of reality crashed down on Emma like a tidal wave. The man she had trusted with her life had abandoned her without a second thought. She pressed her palms against the damp forest floor, trying to steady her shaking body, but the panic clawing at her chest only grew stronger. Her breaths came in ragged gasps as she scanned the area, desperately looking for any sign that this was all just a terrible misunderstanding. But the only thing surrounding her was the vast, unyielding wilderness. The wind rustled through the trees, whispering ominous secrets between the branches. The forest, which had once seemed like a serene getaway, now felt like an endless, suffocating prison. Emma forced herself to stand, hugging her arms around her body as she turned in slow circles, trying to figure out which direction Daniel had driven off in. Maybe she could follow the tire tracks back to a road, but when she looked down, the dirt was untouched. The thick layer of fallen leaves had already hidden any trace of where he had gone. Her heartbeat pounded against her ribs. She had no phone, no map, no idea how far they had traveled or how deep into the wilderness she truly was. A crushing sense of helplessness settled over her, but she refused to let it consume her. She had to move. She had to do something. Emma picked a direction and started walking. Her steps hurried at first, then breaking into a desperate run. She needed to find an opening, a sign of civilization, a path, anything that could lead her to safety. But as she ran, the towering trees seemed to close in around her, their thick branches forming an impenetrable canopy that blocked out the sky. The deeper she went, the more lost she felt. Minutes passed, then hours. Emma wasn't sure anymore. Her throat was dry, her stomach churned with hunger, and her legs ached with exhaustion. The realization that she had no food, no water, and no shelter began to weigh on her. She slowed to a staggering walk, her feet dragging against the forest floor. As the daylight began to fade, fear settled deep in her bones. The temperature had already begun to drop, the warmth of the afternoon sun slipping away as shadows stretched long across the ground. The thought of spending the night alone in the wilderness sent a shiver through her. She had to find shelter before darkness fully consumed the forest. Then a sound, a rustling in the underbrush. Emma froze, her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. Her pulse pounded as she turned toward the noise, her mind racing with possibilities. A deer? A fox? Maybe, just maybe, a person? Someone who could help her? "Hello," she called, her voice shaky. No response. The rustling grew louder, the undergrowth shifting as something large moved through it. Emma took a step back, every muscle in her body tensed. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. The bushes ahead of her trembled violently, and then from the shadows a massive figure emerged. A bear, a towering, powerful creature with thick, dark fur and sharp, glistening eyes. It was unlike anything she had ever seen up close. The sheer size of it made her stomach drop. The bear stepped forward, its heavy paws pressing into the earth, its head tilting slightly as it observed her. Emma couldn't breathe. She had read enough survival guides to know that bears could be unpredictable. Some attacked without warning, others ignored humans completely. But standing still, face to face with one, she had no idea what to do. She tried to remain calm, but her body betrayed her. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps, and her knees threatened to buckle beneath her. Every survival instinct screamed at her to flee, but she knew running would only make things worse. The bear exhaled, its nostrils flaring as it took in her scent. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the worst, and then nothing. She cracked one eye open to find the bear still standing there, watching her with an almost curious expression. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't growling or charging toward her. It was simply waiting. A new kind of fear settled in Emma's chest, one laced with confusion. Why wasn't it harming her? Why hadn't it moved closer? Then just as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear turned away. Emma's breath hitched as she watched the massive creature lumber into the trees, its thick fur blending into the shadows. It didn't run or rush. It moved with purpose, almost as if it expected her to follow. She hesitated, her mind warring between reason and instinct. Following a wild animal was the last thing any sane person would do. But something deep inside her, some primal, unexplainable instinct, urged her to take a step forward. She had no food, no direction, no survival skills. But the bear, it had found her, and something told her that, against all logic, she was meant to follow it. Emma hesitated, her heart still pounding in her chest. Every rational part of her mind screamed at her to stay put, to let the bear disappear into the forest while she figured out another way to survive. But another part, an instinct she couldn't explain, told her to follow. She had no food, no shelter, and no sense of direction. If she stayed here, she might not last the night. The bear lumbered ahead, moving with slow, deliberate steps. It didn't glance back, but something about its presence felt strangely deliberate, as if it knew she was still standing there, deciding. Emma swallowed hard, then took a hesitant step forward, then another. The bear continued moving through the thick underbrush, and before she could stop herself, she was following. Her hands trembled as she pushed past branches and uneven ground, the leaves crunching beneath her weary feet. The air grew cooler, the dense trees blocking out the last remnants of daylight. The deeper she went, the more surreal the situation felt. She was alone in the wilderness, following a massive predator as if it were leading her somewhere safe. Every few steps, the bear would pause, sniff the air, and then continue onward. Emma kept a safe distance, her body tense, but she couldn't deny that she felt something unexpected: hope. She wasn't entirely alone anymore. After what felt like an eternity, the bear finally stopped. Emma nearly bumped into a low-hanging branch as she came to a halt, her breath hitching. Just ahead of her, nestled between towering trees and thick brush, was a small cave. It wasn't large, just enough to provide shelter from the cold, but it was more protection than she had now. The bear turned its head slightly, glancing at her for the first time since she had started following. It didn't growl or move aggressively, but its deep, dark eyes held something that sent a shiver through her spine. She had expected indifference, maybe even mild hostility. Instead, there was something else, something almost watchful. Emma swallowed, unsure of what to do. Was this where the bear lived? Was it inviting her in? Or had she made a terrible mistake by following it? Her legs ached from exhaustion, her throat was dry, and the cold was beginning to settle into her bones. She couldn't afford to wander aimlessly anymore. Carefully, she stepped forward, inching closer to the cave entrance. The bear let out a low huff but made no move to stop her. Emma's hands trembled as she crouched down near the entrance, peering inside. It wasn't deep, but it was large enough for her to curl up safely for the night. The ground was covered in soft dirt and a few scattered leaves, far better than sleeping exposed to the elements. She turned to glance at the bear one last time, half expecting it to change its mind and chase her away. But it simply stood there, watching. And then, as if deciding she was no longer a threat, it lumbered past her and settled down a few feet away from the entrance, its massive body blocking part of the opening. Emma's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just tolerating her presence, it was guarding her. She pressed herself against the cave wall, wrapping her arms around her trembling body. The exhaustion was unbearable, the weight of everything that had happened crushing her at once. Her husband had abandoned her in the middle of nowhere. She had wandered for hours with no hope of survival, and now somehow, against all logic, a wild bear had led her to shelter and was protecting her through the night. Tears welled in her eyes as the weight of it all crashed over her. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, no idea if she would ever find her way back to civilization. But for now, in the heart of the wilderness, she wasn't alone. As the night deepened and the forest fell into silence, Emma let exhaustion pull her under. And just before sleep took her, she thought she heard something she never expected. A deep, rhythmic sound, the steady breathing of the bear beside her, keeping watch. Emma drifted in and out of sleep, the cold seeping into her bones despite the partial shelter of the cave. The rhythmic sound of the bear's breathing was oddly comforting, a strange contrast to the terror she should have been feeling. She wasn't sure if it was exhaustion or sheer survival instinct that allowed her to sleep at all, but somehow, in the presence of a wild animal, she felt safer than she had when Daniel had been by her side. When she finally woke, the first thing she noticed was the faint glow of morning light filtering through the trees. The second thing was the bear. It was still there. Its massive form was curled just outside the entrance, its deep brown fur rising and falling with each slow breath. It had stayed the entire night. Emma pushed herself up, wincing as a sharp pain shot through her stiff muscles. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. She glanced at the bear, half expecting it to turn on her now that the night had passed, but it remained calm. She knew she needed food, water, a way out. Carefully, she stepped over a fallen branch and took a few tentative steps away from the cave, trying to get a better look at her surroundings. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, thick with towering trees and dense undergrowth. There were no signs of trails, no footprints, nothing to suggest she was anywhere near civilization. A deep huff behind her made her freeze. She turned slowly, her heart hammering. The bear had risen to its feet, watching her with those same unreadable eyes. She tensed, unsure of what it wanted. Had she gone too far? Was it finally done with her? But instead of attacking, the bear turned and started walking. It only took a few steps before it stopped, looking back at her expectantly. Emma stared. Was it waiting for her? Her mind warred with itself. This was a wild animal. It owed her nothing. Yet it had led her to shelter last night, and now it seemed to be leading her somewhere else. With no better options, she followed. The bear moved with purpose, navigating the uneven terrain with ease. Emma struggled to keep up, her legs still aching from the previous day's exhaustion. As they walked, she noticed the forest was eerily quiet. No distant hum of cars, no planes overhead. Just the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. After what felt like an eternity, she heard something. A faint trickling sound. Water. Emma's chest tightened with relief. The bear led her to a small stream, its clear waters flowing over smooth rocks. Emma didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees, cupping the cold water in her hands and drinking deeply. The cool liquid soothed her parched throat, giving her the strength she desperately needed. She glanced at the bear, which had stepped into the shallow water, lapping up a drink of its own. Emma sat back, watching it with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. This creature, this powerful wild beast, was helping her, not attacking, not ignoring her. But why? As she stared, a realization hit her. It wasn't just protecting her, it was keeping her alive. She didn't know how long she would be out here, or if she would ever make it back to civilization. But one thing was clear. This bear had become her only hope, and for now she would trust it. Emma wiped the cool water from her lips, her mind racing as she watched the bear. It had saved her life, twice now. First by leading her to the cave, and now by bringing her to water. She couldn't explain it. Was it instinct? Coincidence? Or was there something deeper at play? Whatever the reason, she knew one thing for sure. Without the bear, she wouldn't have survived the night. Her stomach growled again, louder this time. Water had eased her thirst, but hunger gnawed at her, making her feel weak and lightheaded. She glanced around, searching for anything edible. Berries, mushrooms, anything that wouldn't poison her. She knew nothing about foraging, and the thought of eating something toxic terrified her. As if sensing her desperation, the bear suddenly moved. It stepped out of the water, shaking droplets from its thick fur, and lumbered toward the trees. Emma hesitated before following, wondering where it was taking her this time. The bear led her deeper into the forest, its massive paws silent on the damp earth. Emma struggled to keep up, her bare arms scraped by low-hanging branches. Then after a short walk, the bear stopped near a cluster of bushes. Emma watched as it pushed its nose into the foliage, sniffing the small, bright berries growing there. It huffed softly before stepping aside. Emma's heart pounded. Was it showing her food? She hesitated. Could she trust it? Did it even know what was safe for her to eat? The bear watched her, unmoving. Swallowing her fear, she reached out and plucked a berry. She rolled it between her fingers, its deep color almost glistening in the morning light. Carefully, she put it to her lips and took a small bite. The burst of sweetness filled her mouth, and to her relief, there was no bitter aftertaste. She waited a moment, bracing herself for any signs of poisoning, dizziness, nausea, anything. But nothing happened. Encouraged, she grabbed a handful, eating greedily. The fruit wasn't enough to fill her completely, but it gave her energy, just enough to keep moving. She glanced at the bear, a strange sense of understanding passing between them. It had given her shelter, it had led her to water, and now it had shown her food. Emma took a shaky breath, trying to grasp the impossible reality she was living in. She wasn't just surviving in the wilderness, she was surviving because of this bear. As the morning stretched on, Emma followed her unlikely guardian through the forest. The bear moved with steady purpose, never straying too far, always keeping her within sight. It wasn't taming her, and it wasn't treating her like another bear, but it wasn't treating her like prey either. Somehow they had formed an unspoken bond. The hours passed in a haze of exhaustion and hunger, but Emma kept moving, trusting the bear's silent guidance. Then, just as the sun reached its peak, she heard something that made her freeze. Voices, distant, faint, but unmistakably human. Her heart leaped. She wasn't alone anymore. Hope surged through her veins as she turned toward the sound. But as she took a step forward, she hesitated. The bear. It stood still, watching her, its dark eyes unreadable. Emma's breath caught in her throat. If she left now, this would be the last time she ever saw it. This creature had saved her, protected her, and now she was about to walk away. Her throat tightened. She wanted to say something, anything, but words felt meaningless. The bear huffed, a low, deep sound that rumbled through its chest. Then, without another glance, it turned and disappeared into the trees. Emma felt her chest ache as she watched it go, but she knew she had no choice. With one last look at the place that had nearly become her grave and her salvation, she turned and ran toward the voices. The world she had known was waiting for her, but she would never forget the guardian she had left behind. Emma's legs burned as she sprinted toward the voices, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest blurred around her, trees and underbrush flashing past as adrenaline pushed her forward. She didn't know how far the voices were or who they belonged to. All she knew was that she had to reach them before they disappeared. "Help!" she shouted, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and dehydration. "I'm here, please!" Her feet stumbled over a thick root and she nearly fell, but she caught herself just in time. The voices were closer now, clearer. They weren't just echoes in her head. These were real people. Then, through the gaps in the trees, she saw them. Two men in bright orange vests, carrying radios and wearing heavy-duty boots, stood near a clearing. Their backs were turned, but Emma knew without a doubt that they were search and rescue workers. She let out a sob of relief. "Please, over here," she called, forcing herself forward. One of the men whipped around at the sound of her voice. His eyes widened, and in an instant, they were running toward her. "Oh my God," one of them breathed as he caught her before she collapsed. "It's her! We found her!" Emma barely had the strength to respond. Her body sagged with exhaustion, her limbs trembling. She felt someone wrap a jacket around her, and another voice spoke into a radio. "We have her. Repeat, we have the missing woman. She's alive." Alive! The word sent a shiver through her. She had been so close to death, yet somehow she had survived. Not because of her own skills or sheer luck, because of the bear. Tears welled in her eyes as she turned her head back toward the forest, searching for the familiar shadow that had become her protector. But it was gone. She wasn't sure what she had expected. The bear had done its part. It had led her to safety, guided her when she had been too weak to go on, and now it had disappeared into the wilderness where it belonged. As the rescuers guided her toward an ATV waiting on the outskirts of the clearing, Emma felt the weight of everything settle on her chest. The betrayal, the fear, the hunger, the exhaustion. She had been left to die. But something wild, something beyond logic, had refused to let that happen. One of the rescuers handed her a bottle of water, and she took slow, careful sips, the cool liquid soothing her raw throat. "We've been looking for you for days," one of the men said gently. "Your husband reported you missing, said you never came back from a hike." Emma's grip on the bottle tightened. Daniel. The mention of his name made her stomach churn with anger. But more than that, with determination. He had done this to her. He had left her in the middle of nowhere, expecting her to die. He had walked away without a second thought, taking all of their supplies, assuming she wouldn't make it. But she had. And now he was about to face the consequences. The ride back to civilization was a blur. The ATV rumbled over the rough terrain, and then she was in an ambulance, wrapped in blankets, an oxygen mask pressed to her face. She barely processed the beeping of medical equipment or the gentle reassurances of the paramedics. Her mind was fixed on one thing: Daniel. When they arrived at the hospital, reporters were already swarming the entrance, their cameras flashing, their voices blending into a chaotic buzz of questions. How did you survive? What happened in the forest? Is it true your husband abandoned you? Emma didn't answer. Not yet. She had a more important conversation to have first. The moment she was stable, two detectives entered her hospital room, their expressions serious. "Mrs. Clark," one of them said, "we need to ask you about what happened in the forest." Emma took a deep breath. "I'll tell you everything," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. And she did. She told them about the trip, about how Daniel had been acting distant, how he had led her deep into the woods only to leave her there with no supplies. She recounted every detail, the betrayal, the desperation, the nights spent alone. But then she told them something else. She told them about the bear. At first, they exchanged skeptical glances, but the more she spoke, the more they listened. She described how it had found her, how it had led her to shelter, to water, to food. How, in the darkest moment of her life, when a human had abandoned her, a wild animal had chosen to save her. By the time she finished, the detectives were silent. Then one of them nodded. "We'll handle Daniel." Those words sent a wave of relief through her. She didn't have to fight this battle alone. Justice would come for the man who had tried to kill her. Over the next few days, her story spread like wildfire. News outlets couldn't get enough of it. "Wife abandoned in the wilderness, saved by a bear," the headlines read. Experts debated whether the bear had truly understood what it was doing or if it had been mere coincidence. But Emma knew the truth. It had been no accident. A week later, as she stood in front of the hospital window, staring out at the open landscape, she felt something stir inside her. She couldn't just walk away from this. The forest had changed her. The bear had changed her. She knew she had to go back, not to live in fear of what had happened, but to thank the guardian that had saved her life. The moment Emma's story spread, public outrage erupted like wildfire. News outlets, social media platforms, and talk shows all picked up the shocking tale of a husband who had deliberately abandoned his wife in the wilderness, expecting her never to return. The details were too shocking to ignore. A man who had planned his wife's death so he could claim her inheritance, only for her to survive against all odds. People were furious, demanding justice for Emma. Daniel had played the grieving husband well at first. When he reported her missing, he had sobbed in front of the cameras, pretending to be devastated. He had even joined search parties, answering questions with carefully crafted lies. But his act began to fall apart the moment Emma was found alive. The police wasted no time launching an official investigation. Detectives dug into his financial records and uncovered damning evidence. Large withdrawals made days before their trip, and more disturbingly, a life insurance policy he had taken out in Emma's name just months before. The policy was set to pay out a massive sum in the event of her accidental death. With this evidence, detectives confronted Daniel. At first, he denied everything. He tried to twist the story, claiming Emma had run off, that she had gotten lost on her own. But the evidence told a different story. Witnesses, friends and family came forward, revealing that Daniel had always been controlling, and some even admitted that he had spoken about Emma's inheritance in a way that raised suspicions. His fate was sealed when Emma took the stand. Sitting in the courtroom, she faced the man who had left her for dead. She told the jury everything, how he had been distant before the trip, how he had walked away from her in the middle of nowhere without a word, how he had taken the only supplies and left her with no way to survive. She recounted the sheer terror of that first night, the overwhelming loneliness, and the bitter realization that the man she loved had wanted her to die. But then, she spoke about the bear. She told them how, when a human had abandoned her, a wild animal had chosen to protect her. How, instead of attacking, it had led her to shelter, brought her to water, and given her the strength to survive. Some people in the courtroom scoffed at the idea. Others were captivated. But Emma didn't care whether they believed it or not. The bear had saved her life. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty. Daniel was sentenced to 25 years in prison for attempted murder and fraud. As the judge read the sentence, Emma sat still, absorbing the weight of it. She had won. Justice had been served, but no prison sentence could erase the betrayal, the nightmares, the nights she had spent shivering in fear. She had survived not because of the man who had once vowed to love her. She had survived because of something greater. In the months following the trial, Emma found herself unable to return to the life she once had. The world felt different now, and so did she. The experience had changed her in ways she couldn't fully explain. For weeks, she suffered from nightmares, visions of Daniel's cold, emotionless face as he walked away, the crushing loneliness of the wilderness, the fear of never making it out. But in those same dreams, she also saw the bear, its dark eyes watching over her, the steady rise and fall of its breath as it slept outside the cave, the way it had guided her when she had been too weak to go on. People wanted her story. News stations, magazines, and even documentary filmmakers reached out, eager to capture the unbelievable tale of the woman who had been abandoned in the wild, only to be saved by a bear. Some people believed it was fate. Others called it luck. Some dismissed it entirely, claiming the bear's actions had been nothing more than coincidence. But Emma knew the truth. It wasn't just chance. That bear had made a choice. Unable to shake the pull she felt toward the wilderness, Emma began studying wildlife conservation. She learned everything she could about bears, their intelligence, their social structures, their instincts. The more she discovered, the more she realized how misunderstood they were. They weren't ruthless killers, nor were they tame creatures waiting for human companionship. They were powerful, intelligent, and deeply aware of the world around them. Emma started working with conservation groups, using her experience to advocate for bear protection laws and wildlife preservation efforts. She traveled, gave speeches, and helped educate people about the importance of respecting nature. But despite everything, the success, the newfound purpose, there was something she couldn't let go of. She had never gone back to the forest, never returned to the place where she had been both broken and reborn, never seen the bear again. And as time passed, she realized there was only one way to truly find closure. She had to go back. The day Emma stepped back into the forest, her heart pounded with anticipation. The towering trees, the cool, crisp air, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, it all came rushing back to her, triggering memories she had tried to suppress. But this time she wasn't afraid. She wasn't the lost, helpless woman who had stumbled through the wilderness, abandoned and terrified. She had survived. She had grown stronger. The path felt familiar as she retraced her steps, following the same direction she had taken months ago. Her fingers brushed against the rough bark of trees, her feet pressed into the soft earth. The deeper she walked, the more the world around her faded away, until it was just her and the forest. When she reached the small cave, her breath caught in her throat. It was still there, the same rocky shelter that had given her warmth on the coldest night of her life. She stepped closer, crouching at the entrance. The dirt inside was disturbed, the faintest hint of movement still present. Had the bear returned? Did it still use this place? Emma swallowed hard, standing up and turning toward the dense trees. Her heart pounded as she searched for any sign, any movement. And then, she heard it, a deep, familiar huff. Her chest tightened as she turned, and there, standing just beyond the trees, was the bear. It was bigger than she remembered, its dark fur blending into the shadows of the forest. Its eyes locked onto hers, calm and unreadable. Emma didn't move. Neither did the bear. For a long moment, they simply watched each other. Two beings from different worlds, forever connected by an unspoken understanding. Tears welled in Emma's eyes. She wanted to say something, but she knew it wasn't necessary. The bear had never needed words to understand her before. Then, as silently as it had appeared, the bear turned. It took one slow step, then another, before disappearing into the trees. This time, Emma didn't follow. She didn't need to. She had found what she came for, a final goodbye, a silent acknowledgement of what they had shared, and at last, peace. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us bring more incredible survival stories to life. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload, and let us know in the comments. Do you believe animals can sense human emotions? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.